They were the Stopwatch Gang. They had great timing, brilliant planning, outrageous disguises. The FBI didn't have a clue as to their identity. They were unstoppable. Or were they? Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. You can do a lot in 90 seconds. You can listen to the Minute Waltz with time to spare, you can boil an egg, or you can rob a bank. That was exactly how 3 Canadian bank robbers gained notoriety in the US in the 1980s. They were known as the Stopwatch Gang because they used one of these to time their robberies down to the second. At the pinnacle of their success, they hit a bank a week without firing a single shot. But they weren't always successful. They weren't always known as the Stopwatch Gang, and they weren't always bank robbers. The gang first got together in 1973 in Canada's capital, Ottawa. A crate of gold bars en route from a mine up north to the Royal Mint in Ottawa was being stored overnight in a poorly guarded airport warehouse. Paddy Mitchell, who had become the brains of the Stopwatch Gang, viewed stealing the gold as a personal challenge. Paddy's foot soldier was Lionel Wright. Lionel looked after the details: getaway cars, guns, disguises. But for this job, they needed a third guy, someone audacious enough to do anything. That's when they recruited a recent prison escapee, 22-year-old Stephen Reed.
Paddy I met in Ottawa. I had escaped from a place called Warkworth in the fall of '73. And he was sort of the, kind of one of the kingpins in Ottawa. So a friend of mine that I had gone to in Ottawa to sort of hide, to hide out and, get some new clothes and, just get put away for a while, said, I've got the guy for you. And he brought Paddy in and we hit it off right away.
The future Stopwatch Gang just needed one more thing: an inside man, an airport worker who could tip them off to when the gold was in. So Paddy organized a game of cards with an airport worker named Gary Goutanche. The trio purposely let Goutanche win. It seduced him into becoming their inside man. A few days later, Paddy got the signal from Goutanche that the gold shipment had arrived. Now came the tricky part. To get the gold, they had to get into the locked room with a guard who was under strict orders not to let anyone in. So Paddy, pretending to be an irate airport supervisor, demanded to speak to the maintenance man he'd sent over. When the guard said no such man was there, Paddy launched into a tirade about how that damn maintenance man better call him the moment he showed up. As if on cue, there was a knock on the door. Assuming it was the errant maintenance worker, the guard told him he was in serious trouble. That's when the maintenance worker pulled a gun and told the guard he was the one in serious trouble. It would be the biggest gold heist in Canadian history.
Gold is, held such a fascination over there. And I understood why after I handled it. When you handle gold, it is the seducer of mankind.
As the U.S. was on the eve of allowing private citizens to own gold bars, the gang planned to fence the booty in the U.S., where it would net them a hefty $5 million. The best part, they had gotten away cleanly, or so they thought. But the cops had caught Gutanche and cut a deal with him to turn informer. Wiretaps recorded Paddy Mitchell recounting details of the airport gold heist. But detectives still need physical evidence linking the trio to the gold. Though Paddy had fenced the gold in the U.S., when the police recaptured Stephen Reed for being a prison escapee, they find gold flakes in his closet. When the government mints gold bars, they are 99.99% pure gold. But mined gold is never pure. What the mines do is extract the gold and make it into dory bars, each of which has a different percentage of gold mixed with silver and base metals such as bronze. The mine up north had records of the exact percentages for each of the stolen gold bars. When the gold flakes found in Stephen's closet are analyzed, they are consistent with the percentages in one of the dory bars stolen from the airport. Based on this and other evidence, Paddy and Lionel were picked up and the trio was convicted. As a repeat offender, Stephen Reed had 10 years tacked onto his previous sentence for taking part in the gold heist. Paddy Mitchell and Lionel Wright, for their role in the heist and other crimes, were each given 20 years. For most robbers, the story would end here. But these three were not your average criminals. As of one mind, they began to plot their separate escapes. The mild-mannered Lionel Wright was the first one to escape. Call it beginner's luck. He followed a group of fellow convicts through the prison fence to a waiting car. Stephen Reed was next. On an escorted community visit, Stephen convinced his unsuspecting guard to stop for a fish and chips lunch. But Stephen had plans to skip dessert. With his two friends now free, Paddy Mitchell realized if he was going to escape, he would have to come up with an extraordinary plan. He'd heard from a lifer that drinking water mixed with tobacco made your heart speed up. Then he did push-ups till he dropped. It looked like a heart attack. An ambulance was called to take Paddy to the hospital. But two doctors who, if anyone had bothered to notice, looked an awful lot like Lionel and Stephen, intercepted the gurney and escaped with Paddy in the back of a waiting van. It was 1980 and the trio was free. Forced to flee Canada, they slipped into the U.S. Americans were like Canadians with twangy accents, too many guns, and a big problem with crime. The trio would blend in perfectly.
We knew we were in this thing together. I think there was a real defining moment when we became the Stopwatch Gang and really went to work.
The Stopwatch Gang was about to become a legend.
I think that's an interesting thing.
This one piece will make 52 layers.
Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required.
The Stopwatch Gang was about to go on a bank-robbing spree in the southern U.S., the likes of which had never been seen before. The first bank they hit was in San Diego on April 15, 1980. Their goal, to be in and out in 90 seconds. Their approach? A unique Canadian MO, the takeover robbery.
It's going in, taking the bank over, as opposed to going in, oh, please, can I have some money from the teller, you know? It's going in and commandeering the bank, putting everything down, and knowing, you know, what you're going for.
The gang hit 4 San Diego banks in quick succession. The precision of these robberies quickly captured the fascination of the American media and the attention of the FBI.
Most bandits remain in the bank by feel. It's just how long they feel that they've been in there and what they need to get done. But these guys actually timed it right down to about 90 seconds with the use of a stopwatch. So you knew that you were dealing with a group that had its act together. This was not going to be an easy case. Well, I knew that from the very outset.
The gang cut a swath through the American Southwest, pulling jobs in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and along the California coast as far north as Seattle. Polite and professional, they never once fired a single shot.
Between Patty and I, and figuring stuff out and doing the showboating of a score, and Lionel doing the detailed work, we got pretty good, as good as you can get at it.
I had one bandit tell me once that bank robbery was the most potent drug that he had ever taken, and that once he started that kind of activity, there was just no turning back. The level of excitement, the adrenaline rush was stronger than any drug he had ever taken.
The FBI had no clues as to the identities of the Stopwatch Gang.
We can usually identify and track groups of bandits, like the Stopwatch Gang, from one area to another because they do the same thing over and over. What's been successful for them in the past, they're going to, of course, do again. We were able to track them to some degree, but they were very good. Their planning in particular, I took notice of, and they were far and above the regular bandit that I had come across previously.
The FBI turned up the heat, and Stephen Reed felt it.
Because they didn't stop working, just because I did. I mean, they didn't just work during the time of a bank robbery.
This was the Stopwatch Gang's heyday. But any careless word, contradictory story, spurned acquaintance, and the whole deck of cards could come crashing down.
People are pretty smart, you know. You can't just appear out of nowhere with a bunch of money. Of course, Patty and I were our own worst enemies. We'd get drunk and start telling all lies, and our lies would be all crossed up. And so I would worry a lot about people beginning to mount suspicions about us in our circles of friends.
The gang had another problem. The more they stole, the more they spent. Their solution? One fabulous dream score, big enough to retire forever. In September 1980, Stephen cased a bank where every Tuesday a security guard carted a fortune stuffed into 3 money bags from the bank's safe to an armored truck waiting outside. To snatch the money, the gang would have to totally change their MO. No stopwatch. Instead of rushing into the bank and taking it over, the money had to be intercepted between the safe and the armored truck. That meant sitting in the bank and waiting. Instead of gloves, they would have to wrap their fingers in Band-Aids in order to avoid leaving fingerprints. And instead of masks, they would have to resort to other disguises to outfox the security camera. It was way riskier. They took up their positions to wait for the guard to arrive. But this time, the clock would be ticking against them. The Stopwatch Gang was accustomed to being in and out of a bank in 90 seconds. This time, they would be at the mercy of someone else's punctuality. And as fate would have it, on this day, the Brinks truck was late.
They took a little longer than they should have. Than our research showed they should have anyway. It was hard because I had makeup on. Strangely enough, and there was never a sense, nobody paid much attention to us. And, I mean, here's, two dorks in a bank, one with, full beard and sweating, looking like an Arab terrorist, and the other guy looks like, Lionel looked like a little Van Dyke beard and everything. He looked like Colonel Sanders or something. I don't know. He looked weird, with the blonde hair. It was really weird. And we both looked weird. We're just hanging around.
Finally, the guard showed up. As the guard started wheeling the money bags out of the safe to the armored truck waiting outside, his conversation with the bank teller was about to be rudely interrupted. Stephen told the guard, "Don't try to be a hero." The job netted $250,000, the largest bank robbery in San Diego history. Once they dumped anything that connected them to the heist, they'd be free.
After the San Diego score, we were all back at the apartment, and we start throwing this apartment stuff back together. We had garbage bags full of stuff, and I don't know what happened there. We fell off the game plan on this one. We put the wigs in the bank bags up into garbage bags. Lionel generally would burn that stuff. He'd sit at an outside barbecue, or he would just take it home with him back to where we were living at that time, and we would dispose of it slowly. The stuff that puts you in jail.
From the audacity of the robbery and its meticulous planning, the FBI suspected the robbery was the work of the Stopwatch Gang, but they still had no clue about the gang's identity. The FBI's first break came from the bank's surveillance system, which had been taking photos at 30-second intervals.
A photograph certainly will give you a lot to go by, even though they may be completely clothed and have a mask on, because at least you know what kind of evidence you're looking for because you're looking right at it. And certainly now, if we can recover those clothes, it's of great value to you.
While Stephen and Patty went one way with the stolen money, Lionel was left to dispose of the incriminating garbage.
He pulled in, threw the stuff into the dumpster, and he just thought, well, I'll put it there. I'll sit here until this stuff gets gone. And then 2 cops pulled in, and he panicked with the 2 cops there.
Lionel knew if he was nabbed with stuff from the robbery, he might as well plead guilty on the spot. That's when he decided to take a chance that the garbage truck would pick it up as scheduled. It was to be the costliest mistake of his life. An elderly wino found the bag minutes before the garbage truck arrived and thought it might be of interest to the police. He was right. The police handed it over to the FBI. Exhibit A, a green garbage bag. The FBI now had the clothes used by the robbers in the surveillance photos. Plus, a blow-up from one of the surveillance photos revealed that the robber in the dark beard had lost the Band-Aid from his left thumb. When the garbage bag and its contents were dusted for prints, the lab turned up a latent thumbprint on the garbage bag itself.
Well, fingerprints don't lie. And certainly a fingerprint is worth 1,000 words, so to speak.
The FBI still needs to match it to a known print to come up with a name. But when they check the print against known felons, they come up empty-handed. It means none of the members of the Stopwatch Gang have ever been arrested in the U.S. The FBI is stumped. Unaware of the FBI's evidence, the gang had been in touch with a big-time crook who promised that for a chunk of cash, he would introduce them to a surgeon who could alter their fingerprints. But when the crook got busted for drugs, he ratted out the gang in exchange for his freedom. He gave the FBI their names and a copy of their fingerprints. They could now connect Stephen Reed to the San Diego robbery. The Stopwatch Gang had been caught by its fingertips. Meanwhile, the Stopwatch Gang were unaware that this would be the last time the three of them would be together. The FBI had broken the case. Lionel was arrested while still in bed. Stephen was stopped for a minor traffic violation and found himself surrounded by armed FBI agents. But they couldn't find Paddy. The FBI expected that Stephen or Lionel would rat on Paddy in exchange for a deal. They were wrong. According to Stephen Reed, with Canadians, there was honor among thieves.
Canadians are not, I mean, even, the FBI and different people, as we're arrested, would, have talked about, we're known for holding our mud, you get caught, you stand up and take one on the chin.
Paddy Mitchell, put on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, was caught in 1983, then escaped. In 1995, FBI agent Steve Chenoweth put together a profile on Paddy and appealed for public help through a TV program. The move paid off. Someone gave the FBI an address. Time had run out on the Stopwatch Gang. Paddy Mitchell was sentenced to 68 years in prison. He'll be in his late 80s before he's eligible for parole. Lionel Wright was finally released from prison in 1994. He had run the prison canteen so meticulously that he was subsequently hired by Corrections Canada. In 1985, Stephen Reed wrote a novel, Jackrabbit Parole. That caught the attention of poet Susan Musgrave. They were married in prison, and a year later, Stephen was paroled. But in 1999, Stephen Reed was charged with committing a new bank robbery. Our interview with him was conducted in prison. It's fine to romanticize about guys like the Stopwatch Gang and think their actions only hurt the big bad banks. On the other hand, maybe the only reason no one was seriously hurt was simply because they were never challenged during one of their robberies. We could debate this for hours, but it's important to know when to go. A mother's only son, dead from a shotgun blast. His best friend swore it was a suicide, but she knew it was a murder. Bad science let a killer walk free. Could good science put it right again? Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. For a single mother, losing your only son through violent means is absolutely devastating. What's even worse is watching the person responsible for his death walk free. At 2:40 on a February morning, police receive a 911 call. The frantic caller says that his best friend has just shot himself in his parents' basement. police find the body of Adam Matthews lying dead on the floor in a pool of blood. According to Greg Connors, they had been drinking when Adam took Greg's shotgun into the workroom and killed himself. But Greg Connors is acting so erratically. Police have no choice but to cuff him and bring him down to the station. Coroner Jim Cairns, who would later review the case.
The scene was secured by police, and various photographs were taken off the scene before the body was moved. But that was the initial scene, was the deceased lying on the floor with a shotgun in his hand. There was a conclusion reasonably early on that this was a suicide.
Back at the station, Greg Connors tells police that he and Adam had been drinking and watching a video in the rec room while Greg's parents slept upstairs. Adam wanted to see Greg's shotgun. He left it with Adam when he felt sick and went to throw up. That's when Adam went into the adjacent workroom and shot himself. Maybe it's just a detective's instinct, but there's something about Greg Connors' response to the tragic loss of a close friend that just doesn't ring true. Plus, it's rare for a suicide victim to impulsively shoot themselves with someone else's gun in someone else's house. Hoping to get more evidence, the detective sends a new ident person back to videotape Greg Connors' basement. Then comes one of the hardest parts of a detective's job: breaking the tragic news of a son's death to his mother. Linda Matthews is devastated. She refuses to believe that her son killed himself. She knows her son. He lived at home. It is impossible. If anything was bothering him enough to kill himself, she would have known about it. Adam was a well-adjusted young man. It doesn't make any sense. Of course, it's not the first time the detective has seen a parent unwilling to accept her child's suicide. Back at the station, he studies the pathologist's report.
In basic summary, the conclusions of the pathologist reached at that time was that this was a contact wound to the neck of the deceased, so that the end of the barrel was against the deceased's neck when the trigger was pulled.
That's when the detective turns to the new ident videotape of what may now be a crime scene and discovers to his dismay that the basement has been totally cleaned up. The blood-soaked carpet is gone, and the blood has been cleaned off the workroom wall. The detective now has a serious problem. He will have to rely solely on the original crime scene photos, taken in the first hour after the police arrived at the scene of what was called in as a suicide. As the detective studies the photos, something nags at him: the shotgun in Adam's hand. He can't remember ever hearing of a shotgun suicide where, given the force of the recoil, the victim caught the gun in a pistol-like grip. The preliminary ballistics report states that Considering the length of Adam's arm and the length of the shotgun barrel, Adam could barely have reached the trigger to shoot himself. But if it is a homicide, why? Why would a friend kill a friend? Linda Matthews is tortured by the same question. She has been rethinking everything that happened the day Adam died. She remembers coming home from work and seeing her son outside talking to his friend Rick. Something seemed to be bothering Adam. He'd also gotten 4 phone calls from Greg Connors that day. The last one just as he walked in the door. Then he'd left immediately for Greg's. She didn't like Greg. Didn't like the way he treated Adam. Didn't like the fact that Greg had run-ins with the police. She is convinced Greg had more to do with Adam's death than he told police. When she contacts Rick, what he tells her and the detective adds a crucial piece to the puzzle. The month before, Adam and Greg had gone out driving in Greg's truck. And Greg had totaled his truck against a tree. Greg got Adam to go along with a lie he made up, that the truck had been stolen and the thieves had crashed it. That way, Greg could collect the $23,000 insurance money. But Adam told Rick he had decided he wasn't going to lie for Greg anymore. He was going to come clean with the insurance company. That was the day Adam died. The detective now has a motive. Greg Connors is arrested and charged with criminal negligence causing death because he was intoxicated at the time of the shooting. But despite the arrest, nothing lessens Linda Matthews' unbearable pain. As she awaits the trial, she sinks into a deep depression. Her only hope is that justice will somehow be served. Because blood tests indicate that Greg Connors was drunk when he allegedly shot Adam Matthews, he had not been charged with murder, rather with criminal negligence causing death. As Linda Matthews gets herself ready for the trial, she has every reason to believe that Greg Connors will be convicted of killing her son. But the alleged motive is discounted, and the science she's counting on turns out to be her worst enemy. The original firearms expert surprised everyone by claiming that Adam Matthews could have shot himself. A second firearms expert who reviewed the case years later was floored by this claim.
The only way he could have fired it is to have laid it along his arm, thusly, held the muzzle up to the throat thusly, and pushed the trigger with his finger. An incredibly awkward way to kill yourself with a firearm. Incredibly. I've never seen anything like that before.
But at Greg Connors' trial, the original firearms expert is believed.
The further opinion of the firearms examiner was that this was possible and that once he pulled the trigger, he could in some way manage to grab onto the gun and fall with the gun in his hand, in the manner in which it was found at the scene with a pistol grip on the shotgun.
The judge agreed. The charges against Greg Connors were reduced to giving a loaded shotgun to an intoxicated person.
And at the same time, the judge made a ruling that the deceased had died as a result of his own actions, so that the deceased had in fact committed suicide.
Adam's mother was outraged. It was hard to say what hurt her more, the courts officially ruling that her son had committed suicide, which was impossible, or his murderer being allowed to walk free. She swore to Greg Connors that he was not going to get away with her son's murder. But what could she do? As a first step to having the case reopened, she obtains the crime scene photos through the Freedom of Information Act. If she wants others to one day believe that Adam never killed himself, she must first be willing to face the evidence herself. In order to build a case for an appeal, she sends copies of the crime scene photos to leading forensic experts in the U.S. for their independent opinions. She mounts a one-woman campaign to clear her son's name. For the first time since her son's death, Linda Matthews feels alive. The results begin to come back, and they're positive. According to these experts, she's right. Her son's death is not a suicide. It's a homicide. Armed with these reports, she goes to the detective to try to have the case reopened. That's when she's floored by two words that are going to haunt her: double jeopardy. According to the law, no one can be tried for the same crime twice. It would be easy for her to give up and sink back into her depression, blaming the system for the rest of her life. But at her core, Adam's mother is a fighter. She's come too far to give up. Now it's not just about her son's death. It's about truth itself. There has to be another way. She sends her findings to the one person who may be able to help her, Deputy Coroner Jim Cairns. Though double jeopardy protects Greg Connor from ever being retried, an inquest can at least establish a public truth. Jim Cairns is impressed. She has done her homework and is willing to let the science speak for her.
You're looking for scientific truth, and it's important. It's just as important to correct bad science as it is to have good science.
Jim Cairns decides to convene an inquest. A 5-person jury will now decide whether or not they agree with the original findings, that the first trial was right and Adam Matthews' death was a suicide, or the first trial was wrong and his death was a homicide and a murderer walked free. Will the system fail Linda Matthews a second time? It would all come down to Exhibit A, the original crime scene photographs. Linda Matthews needs to know, and needs the public to know, what happened to her son in that basement workroom 6 years ago. An inquest will finally determine whether her son committed suicide or was murdered. A second set of experts will have to re-examine what had been presented as forensic fact by the first set of experts. All the experts have are these: Exhibit A, the original crime scene photographs, taken in the first hour after the police arrived at the scene of what was called in as a suicide. The inquest returns to the story presented in the original trial, that Adam Matthews shot himself in the neck and somehow managed to hold onto the shotgun as he fell to the floor. The first witness Jim Cairns calls upon is firearms expert Jim McQuaw.
The recoil of this shotgun is quite severe. In tests that I did from a table with this shotgun and the same type of ammunition, it launched itself 23 feet 11 inches from the table. How could he hold that gun?
The original firearms expert had testified that the shotgun had somehow ended up in the victim's hand.
What are the odds of it bouncing back and landing in his hand? Well, the odds are so remote as to be totally unthinkable. Bounce off the ceiling, the wall, the floor, and then just happen to come back and land in his hand so that his finger is through the trigger and his other fingers are wrapped around the grip. It's beyond my comprehension that this could occur. I'd have to believe in the tooth fairy.
Working with the same photos, bloodstain analyst Vince Hawkes agrees with McQuaw and disagrees with the original pathologist's report that the shotgun had been against Adam's neck at all.
It's physically impossible for that end of that weapon to have been tight against the individual's neck and leave the amount of backspatter that was left on that wall. Physically impossible. As we make that scenario change a little and move that weapon further away from the blood source, the further you move the weapon away from the blood source, the larger the impact area, and hence the more projected stains that can contact the various surfaces. And that's what we have in this case.
But proving where the shotgun was not is one thing. Proving where it actually was is another.
So to determine this, I fired tests at various distances using the same shotgun, same type of ammunition, and measuring the spread of the shot, I can say with some degree of certainty that the shot was fired between these two distances, somewhere between 3 feet and 5 feet.
Someone else must have been holding that weapon from this distance. By analyzing the photographs of the blood stains on the victim's left hand, Vince Hawkes is able to determine something even more remarkable.
This individual's hand has to be in an orientation that it's up in front of his face like this, with the index finger extended as well as the thumb extended. So it cannot be in the position of extended straight out pushing that trigger. It has to be in a position like this. Physically impossible to be in any other position based on the bloodstains. Now we have the scenario of the individual standing up against the workbench. We have the scenario of the right hand having no projected stains on it associated to holding the weapon, and we have the left hand in a position like this. To me, that is a defensive position at the time of impact.
So the victim was trying to defend himself from something or someone.
I was able to calculate the height of the wound in the deceased's throat if he was standing. And I was able to correlate the center of the pattern with the wound in his throat, and I was able to determine that the shotgun itself was at shoulder height when that shot was fired. This particular shotgun was up here, and this is the position that a shotgun is intended to be fired from.
The jury has three choices: suicide, homicide, or accidental death. It takes them exactly 2 hours to decide, and when they return, they rule Adam's death a homicide. This is the scenario that they now believe took place on that February morning 6 years ago. They had been drinking, watching TV. Maybe Adam told Greg he was going to come clean about Greg's false insurance claim. Maybe. What we do know is that somehow Adam was lured or forced into the workroom. Then, as he tried to defend himself, someone holding the shotgun in the aim position from 3 to 5 feet away shot him and placed the shotgun in his hand to make it appear like a suicide. By his own testimony, the only other person in the basement at the time was Greg Connors. The world would now know what Linda Matthews had never doubted, that her son had been murdered.
It's very powerful when you think about that one woman's desire to learn the truth caused all this to happen and end up the way it has. It's pretty important, I think, for her to have sat through the coroner's inquest and to see what she truly believed come true based on physical evidence, not based on what people think happened, based on the true physical evidence.
This certainly was a case where an individual went free initially because of science, and at least as far as the true facts were then able to be corrected by once again by science. So there was some validation of the science, but it did involve breaking down the previous scientific conclusions that were reached.
The world would now know what Linda Matthews never doubted, that her son had not committed suicide. He had been murdered. She had her verdict, but ultimately, was justice really served? Despite 6 years, a trial, and an inquest, Greg Connors could not be tried for the same crime again. That would be double jeopardy. A killer walked free. Two years after the inquest's verdict, Linda Matthews died of cancer. She is buried next to her son, Adam. Police are up against a serial rapist, an odious criminal, and one of the hardest to catch. But can a tenacious investigator using a new forensic tool, geographical profiling, zero in on where the rapist lives and nab him? Enter the world of forensic science, the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. We tend to think of criminals as outlaws, out there, thinking totally differently than we do. But investigators tell us that's a mistake. Criminals are so much like us, they're often invisible, unsuspected. It was the summer of 1987 in Lafayette, Louisiana. Like the gators, he was always looking for prey. And he found her. The woman seemed to live alone. He would come back later. He snipped the telephone wire.
What he'd do is he'd break in while the victims are asleep. Demand money. He'd go through their purses, have them empty their purses. But afterwards, then he'd actually commit the sexual assault.
He was what profilers call a power reassurance rapist. His approach, I'm in control, and if you do what I say, nothing will happen to you. Then he intimidated the woman by telling her he wouldn't have come in and raped her if only she had kept her window locked. Finally, he warned her that if she reported him to police, he would come back and hurt her or her loved ones. In 1987, Mac Gallion was a patrolman accompanying the detective called in to investigate the rape. Little did he know that this would become his career-defining case.
Well, at that time, there were no suspects. Also, we didn't use DNA at that time. We had really nothing to go on. There were no evidence that we could use at that particular time to make an arrest.
The rapist had cleaned up after himself and left no fingerprints, no hairs, no fibers. But a vaginal swab yielded a sample of the rapist's semen. Though the sample wasn't of immediate use, it was preserved. As for the woman, she was traumatized. Ahead of her were years of overwhelming fear and mistrust, broken relationships, and black holes of depression, and the terror of knowing that the rapist was still out there. Seven years passed. Mac Gallion had risen in the ranks and had become a detective himself. That's when he was called out on another rape case.
I had an opportunity to actually speak with the victim. She was later taken to the hospital where she was examined and evidence was collected there.
The woman described how the man had attacked while she was asleep. He wore a bandana. He said he was there to rob her and then raped her. The description was that of a power reassurance rapist.
You see, rapes are not acts of sex, but more of an act of power to power upon a person.
A vaginal swab in this 1994 assault also yielded a semen sample of the rapist. Though by 1994, DNA testing had been added to the forensic arsenal, the sample didn't match any of the likely suspects. This rape, too, seemed unsolvable. Then, a year later, in 1995, Mac overheard a conversation between a detective and a sergeant about a third rape. It sounded like they were reading from his 1994 case file. It starting out as a robbery, the bandana, blaming it on the woman herself, another power reassurance rapist excited by control. Mac asked them for a biological sample from this new rape case. When the DNA was compared to the sample from his 94 case, it was a match.
He had asked me to see if two unsolved cases might possibly have come from the same source. He felt that the MOs of the cases were similar enough to be the same person. We compared the two DNA profiles, and we did find that they were identical. And that's when we knew we had a serial rapist operating.
Mac thought about the case from 1987 and had that biological sample tested as well. It too came back a match. Mac went back into the Lafayette police files. With uncanny skill, he picked out more than a dozen other unsolved cases between 1987 and 1995 where the rapist's MO seemed similar. DNA confirmed they were all the same rapist. Because all the assaults took place in one particular area, he was dubbed the South Side Rapist. But what was the underlying pattern? All the women were white, but of different ages. All the women were attacked in their homes, but their homes ranged from upper class to low-income housing projects. Mac was put in charge of the investigation. Certain questions would plague him. Who was this rapist? What did he look like? Where was he? What would it take to catch him? And how many more women would be raped before he was caught? The Southside Rapist had struck at least 15 times between the years 1984 and 1995.
I always felt a sense of urgency on this case because I could never tell when he was going to go out and actually do this again. And I mean, the individuals who are attacked like that, I mean, their lives are just completely thrown out of regular norms. It really does horrible things to them.
In 1995, Mack helped set up a special task force, but amazingly the rapist didn't strike that year, or the next. So by the end of 1996, the task force was disbanded. Once again, it was just Mack. Then he got a break. The survivor of the 1994 rape had a nightmare in which, for an instant, she glimpsed the rapist's face. Upon waking, she realized it was a memory she had suppressed, but she couldn't recall the rapist's face clearly enough to describe him to a police sketch artist. That's when Mack decided to enlist the help of a hypnotist.
It said that we can recall anything that we hear, see, feel, taste, or touch. It's permanently ingrained there. It's just a matter of getting back to it. But through hypnosis, we can take you back in time to that place and tap into your subconscious and get that information.
Though the woman was scared about reliving the experience, she consented to a session with a hypnotist and a police sketch artist. Anything to help catch the rapist. As the event was too brutal and traumatic to put the woman directly back in the past, the hypnotist uses the movie theater technique, where the subject is told she is watching a movie of the event, a documentary of her life.
Is she going to still experience some of the anxiety? Certainly, but it's not quite the same as taking her back through that experience.
He gives her a remote control so she can control the movie. It's just like a regular remote, but with one additional special button, a panic button. Whenever she needs to, she can stop the movie, and all her fears and anxieties will melt into the chair and drain away. Then it's time to start. With her eyes closed, he mentally guides her into a movie theater, down the aisle, and to her seat. The movie begins the day before and takes the woman through everything that led up to the rape.
In hypnosis, we can cover a day in 30 minutes. We can fast forward, we can rewind, we can still time, we can freeze frame time, so to speak. And in her particular case, we took her back to that date and time. When we started to get into the actual sexual assault, the victim started sweating profusely. She was very red in the face. There were several times where we had to just stop in a still frame and assure her that she was very safe and very secure. Actually, what we did was rewound the film and then had her go back through step by step in this process, where she went through the actual rape up until the point in time where she told us that the rapist, in fact, did remove this handkerchief at a specific point in time, momentarily, to kiss her, and then pushed it back up. At that point in time, we rewound, we froze that frame, and then we were able to go through step by step, starting with the eyes, then the nose, then the mouth, the cheeks, the neck area, the ears, the overall head, the hair, the eyebrows, the forehead, getting all of that information during that hypnosis session as the composite sketch artist would sketch it.
Suspects who bore a resemblance to the sketch were questioned about being the Southside rapist. Some had solid alibis. Those who didn't were asked for DNA samples. But there was no match. But Mack refused to give up. He knew the survivors would never feel closure until the rapist was caught. He read books on psychological profiling and reread the FBI's file on the Southside rapist. In 1997, police had called a meeting of all the known victims of the Southside rapist. One similarity many of them reported was that the rapist carried a large black flashlight. One woman said that she could feel its heat next to her, and that the way the rapist held it was just like a policeman. Now you can buy one of these types of flashlights at the local hardware store. But back in the 1980s, they were pretty much only used by police, firefighters, utility workers, and security guards. This fit the FBI profile that the Southside rapist might be a police officer or a police wannabe. Then something strange happened in Mac's own house. He and his wife had gone to a function at his daughter's school. When he came home, his front door was wide open. Nothing had been stolen or disrupted. Was the Southside rapist now searching for Mac as much as Mac was searching for him? DNA hadn't cracked the case, nor had the police sketch. So Mac contacted Canadian Kim Rossmo, who had pioneered a new forensic tool, geographical profiling.
Geographic profiling comes out of a theoretical area called environmental criminology, which doesn't ask the question, why did Johnny become a bad boy? It says, assuming Johnny's a bad boy, what is the influence of the environment on his crime patterns?
More specifically, it asks, where should investigators look for Johnny?
Rather than figure out where crimes will happen, the question was, if we already know where they've taken place, what can we say about where the person responsible for those crimes most probably lives?
Exhibit A, a map of Lafayette, Louisiana. Profilers would try to zero in on the rapist's hunting area, the most likely area where this predator lived. In May of 1998, geographical profilers Kim Rossmo and Brad Moore flew from Vancouver to see if they could help Detective Mac Gallion catch the Southside rapist.
Our goal is to see the crime sites both during the day, because that's when you can actually see them, but also during the time that the offender's committing the offenses, because the world is very different. For example, it is very different at 4 p.m. than it is at 4 a.m., and it's different on a Sunday than it is on a Wednesday.
At each location, they look at what surrounds the house. What was at the end of the street? What was around the corner? Where people parked? The footpaths? The hiding places? The possible escape routes? Anything that could help them zero in on the predator's hunting pattern. They're hunting the hunter, so they try to put themselves in the predator's shoes and see the world as he does.
It could be whether the lights appear to be on and we can tell that from the road, whether or not there's a two-car garage where only one car is parked there with draperies or curtains are left open, signs of maybe decay or an indication that a man is not present might be relevant for a sexual assault type of crime.
One thing all the targets shared was that they were quite accessible from the street, and it would have been easy for the rapist to check it out from the sidewalk or peer in a window. It suggested the rapist was not a stalker who followed women home, but rather a prowler, a predator who roamed the area hunting for prey.
It's been said that humans are just more complicated forms of animals, and I think we see that with hunting behavior. Animals need to eat, and animals need to avoid being eaten. We can see the same thing with criminals. They need to find victims, but they also don't want to get caught by the police.
After 3 exhaustive days, Kim Rossmo flew back to Vancouver and fed all the data into Rigel, his software program named for a star in the belt of Orion the Hunter.
We take all the crime locations and we put them in as coordinates, or we digitize them directly onto the map of the area. And then the computer will generate, in this case, about 500,000 calculations, and will produce for us what we call a jeopardy surface, the most likely area of offender residence.
Lafayette's total area is about 61 square kilometers or 24 square miles. The profilers had narrowed down where the rapist probably lived to a 1 square mile area. Then, on December 1st, 1998, police receive an anonymous tip to check out Randy Como, who is an officer in the Lafayette Sheriff's Office. Mac gets a trusted friend at the sheriff's office to secretly fax him Randy Como's personnel file. Randy Como's home address is well inside the geographical profiler's jeopardy zone. Even more damning, the house he lived in prior to 1991, when most of the rapes took place, is dead center. Now he checks the composite sketch. These days, Randy Como has changed his overall appearance. He wears glasses and sports a new hairstyle. But photos of Como before 1995 show a remarkable resemblance to the suspect. The lab has a DNA sample of the Southside rapist. Now they need Como's DNA. So an investigator working undercover obtains one of Como's discarded cigarette butts. Then on Christmas Eve, 1998, Mac calls Arthur Young at the lab.
I watched as the information came off the computer, and I equate it to being a lottery winner on a Saturday night, watching the numbers roll down, and I'm looking at my ticket. 1 match, 2 match, 3 match, 4 match. And after a certain point, I just said, this is it. This case can finally be closed, and I can get it off my desk. It had been sitting there for that long, 6 years.
Ernest Randall Como was arrested.
Afterwards, after he was handcuffed, it appears as though he became very down. It's like it was all over, which is what I told him. I told him it was over. He didn't have to worry anymore, it was over.
He confesses for 6.5 hours, even admitting to 2 rapes investigators hadn't known about. It turns out Como was a prowler, not a stalker. When he saw a house that appeared to be without a man, he would come back later with his rape kit and look for an open window. What made Como's mental and physical assault on these women especially odious was that he had worked in youth services with teens who'd been raped.
I look at it as Randy Como is a rapist trying to be a police officer, not a policeman out raping folks. Because nobody that's sworn to do what we're sworn to do would go out and do a thing like that.
Ernest Randall Como was sentenced to 25 years on 19 counts of rape. There are a lot of women who can now have some closure in their lives, knowing that the person who traumatized them has been caught and is finally being punished.
I think Lafayette and the surrounding areas of Acadiana were very fortunate to have an individual like Mac Gallion on this case, because I'm certain that without him, this case would not have reached a conclusion.
But for Mac Gallion, the real heroes of the case are the forensic scientists and the women themselves. And in particular, one woman who was willing to journey into her subconscious to help capture a dangerous predator. Two sisters, both promising athletes. But a powerful presence stalks their young lives. His sights are set on one, and he must control her every move. When his desire turns to violent obsession, police must find this man possessed. Enter the world of forensic science the science of crime, where a suspect's guilt or innocence can hang on a single piece of evidence. To love means to cherish and protect, but a stalker pursues, harasses, and threatens. A stalker cannot love, but might be willing to kill. It's late August 1995. Jolene Samuels is only days away from the greatest adventure of her life. At 19, she's about to leave her Toronto home with a track scholarship to the University of Alabama. She's going to miss her mother and younger sister, Bethany. Her mother, Marianne, is divorced. She's proud to see her oldest daughter spread her wings and head out on her own. Jolene is taking the last few days before she departs to relax and do her packing. She sees her mother and Bethany off to work. It hasn't been a good year for Jolene, and she's glad to be leaving her old life behind. A knock brings her to the door. It's Bethany. Marianne returns home from work that evening at her regular time. She yells hello to the girls, but gets no reply. Something's not right. Jolene's t-shirt is lying crumpled in the hall. There's a red smear on the door to the basement. At the foot of the stairs, she discovers an unspeakable horror. In shock, she runs to a neighbor who calls the police. Are Jolene and Bethany innocent victims of a break-and-enter gone terribly wrong? Investigators rush to the scene. Things aren't what they appear to be.
Well, the flag started to go up for us as soon as we walked in the door, long before we got to the basement and saw the bodies.
A TV, stereo equipment, and a toaster have been piled together by a back door. But these aren't the usual targets of break-and-enter thieves. Small, valuable items are left in plain view, untouched. The kind of loot thieves find easy to conceal and quick to sell.
But it didn't look like any break-and-enter that any of us had ever seen before. By the time we got down to the basement, we knew that this was not a break-and-enter gone bad. There was something much more personal and intimate to this particular crime.
Investigators believe that evidence of a break-and-enter was staged to cover up a premeditated murder. Forensic identification officers scour the scene searching for clues. All they find of the murder weapon are 2 shattered pieces of a knife handle. The bodies of the murdered girls are sent to the morgue, where they're examined by pathologist Dr. Toby Rose.
This is a diagram that I made when I was preparing my report, and it shows the large wound to the younger sister's, the front of her neck. I think the younger sister was murdered first because she has absolutely no injury to her hands or her arms at all. So it appears that she wasn't able, or was so surprised in time that she wasn't able to fight back at all. I thought that the older sister was murdered second. The wound to her neck was quite similar to the wound to the younger sister's neck. The younger sister had only a single stab wound on the skin of her chest, but the older sister had multiple stab wounds, and I estimated them as 19 stab wounds. I also thought that she was murdered second because she does have evidence of having fought back. She has knife wounds to both hands.
Dr. Rose performs one more standard procedure, a simple act that will prove vital later in the case.
We always clip their fingernails if they have long enough fingernails to do that. And we submit those in an envelope, a sealed envelope, to the Center of Forensic Sciences for analysis. And that's to see if there's any kind of evidence or tissue or material under their fingernails that can be analyzed and used.
The ident unit spends many intensive days searching the house, hoping to find fingerprints or any clues that might identify the killer. They find no fiber or hairs which might help their investigation, but 30 sets of identifiable fingerprints are successfully lifted from the house. The problem is that all 30 sets of fingerprints belong to either Jolene or Bethany.
So the standard forensic evidence that you glean from homicide scenes, the fingerprints, things of that nature, weren't there for us in any beneficial way.
The killer may have worn gloves. He'd been careful to cover his tracks. Investigators call in Detective Inspector Kate Lyons, an expert in behavioral profiling. She views police videotape of the crime scene in order to understand the nature of the killer.
It's almost like you could just feel the anger that the person that was inflicting these injuries on these young girls must have felt, because they were very emotional, very deep, very penetrating.
Kate Lyons thinks that Jolene was the primary target because of the particularly brutal wounds on her body.
This is absolute explosion of rage to be able to inflict these type of injuries on these victims. And it was certainly clear to me that this was someone, again, who had a relationship. We call that an intimate stalker, that they've had an intimate relationship. Stalking is a very common occurrence prior to a homicide.
Jolene and Bethany were two innocent young women with bright futures ahead of them. But someone they knew wanted them dead. Why? Investigators know they are dealing with a savage and clever criminal. They know the staged break and enter is a cover for a frenzied murder. The day after the murders, Marianne tells police a chilling tale. Jolene had been going out with a young man named Rohan Ranger for several years. She'd broken off the relationship 11 months ago and started seeing other boys. But Ranger was obsessed with her. He followed her everywhere. Rohan Ranger couldn't accept that Jolene wasn't his anymore. That's more than enough for police to pick up Ranger for an interview. But Ranger surprises them by being open and cooperative. He doesn't act like a man with anything to hide. He volunteers to give police a blood sample for DNA analysis. And he tells a very different story than Marianne about his relationship with Jolene. He claims she wasn't dating anyone else, and that she wanted him to visit her in Alabama. They were still in love.
In one case, you have this relationship that's broken up and she wants nothing to do with him. On the other hand, you're talking to Ranger and you think, my God, they're planning on getting married.
The two stories are so contradictory that police suspicions of Ranger are only increased. They place him under surveillance. They see him at the girl's funeral among the 3,000 other mourners. They wait to see if he will appear at the more intimate memorial service at the local high school. Investigators are shocked to learn that, strangely enough, Jolene had made arrangements for her own funeral, asking a friend to sing Amazing Grace at whatever service might be held. And she made a bet with another friend that she would be murdered. The friend agreed to pay $10 if Jolene won. Ranger appears near the very end.
He actually went up to the mother and expressed his condolences and gave her a hug that she described to me as the coldest moment that she can recall.
Mark Mendelsohn becomes even more suspicious of Ranger because he has discovered that the only things missing from the house were personal items of Jolene's.
Out of this entire home and all the ransacking and the moving around of stereos and toasters and VCRs and the dumping out of drawers from dressers, there were only 3 things that were missing from that home.
Gone is a videotape of Jolene playing soccer. Her electronic organizer, including the phone numbers of her friends, is missing.
But most importantly was a gold necklace that Ranger had purchased for the older sister some years back. This necklace never left her neck. She ran track and field events with it. She swam with it. She played soccer with it. She slept with it on. The necklace that she was not allowed to take off, because if Ranger ever saw her without it, he would get upset, is missing.
In Jolene's last weeks, her growing independence was constantly being thwarted by Ranger's obsessive control.
It may be difficult for some of us to understand, but again, for some individuals, they sometimes feel that their lives become so out of control that this person, no matter how much they try to pull away from them, seems to be coming back into their lives and trying to control them. As much as they try and pull away, that other person seems to be so obsessive about them that sometimes, and again, this is not uncommon, that victims almost become accepting of whatever fate has in store for them. They don't see that they really have a lot of choices to make.
Marianne tells police that she saw Jolene struggling to free herself from Ranger's control. But Jolene told her in an ominous tone that if anything happened, Rohan Ranger was responsible. Marianne tells police that 2 days before the murders, she overheard Jolene and Ranger having a vicious argument in the basement of her home. He demanded that Jolene give up her track scholarship and stay with him in Toronto. She refused.
For a moment in her life, she stood up and she said, "No, I'm going." And if you're a defiant, controlling, conniving individual, that could set you off, I think, as easily as anything.
4 months after the murders, forensic biologists conclude their examination of Jolene's fingernail clippings. What they find becomes Exhibit A, DNA from a tiny amount of skin tissue under the fingernail that does not belong to Jolene.
Finding DNA, foreign DNA under fingernails is, in our experience, a rare and significant finding.
Investigators hope that DNA from this material will identify the person Jolene must have deeply scratched only moments before her death. The results stun the investigative team.
If we have, for example, in sample number A, the profile from the fingernail scrapings, and sample number B is the profile from Rohan Ranger, then I can tell you instantly that Rohan Ranger is not the source of the sample of the fingernail scrapings. Those profiles do not match, they're different. He is excluded as the source of the foreign DNA in the fingernail scrapings.
This information turns the investigation upside down. Is it possible that all the circumstances which point to Ranger as the murderer are mere coincidence? If so, then who is the killer? Despite the startling DNA evidence, Mark Mendelsohn can't shake his belief that Rohan Ranger must be involved in the murders.
You still can't remove him from the investigation, and the reason is you've got the motive. She's leaving. He doesn't like it. You have the stalking, the following. You have the threatening. He has to remain in, and we have to keep our focus open and our minds clear that there's a second person involved.
Police intensify their surveillance on Ranger and his circle of friends. One by one, they are checked out. They all give blood samples. None of them can be implicated in the crime, but maybe there's someone they've missed. They follow Ranger to a park where he seems to be waiting for someone. A car pulls up and a stranger gets out.
We didn't know who this guy was. We had no idea who this guy was, but it was the first person that Ranger had contact with that we had never seen before.
This is Adrian Kincaid. Investigators had heard about him, but they were told he had left the country. He's Rohan Ranger's cousin, and before he dropped from sight, the two were inseparable. Investigators find out that Kincaid is a vicious character with a violent temper. Everyone who knows Kincaid says that he cares nothing for other people, even his own child.
The mother of the child told us about him hanging this 9-month-old child out a 9-story window because the kid was crying. And he said he would stop the child from crying. So he has no respect for anything, let alone human life.
But when police try to locate him for an interview and a DNA sample, he has vanished. But they do locate his former girlfriend and child. They receive permission from her to perform what's known as a reverse paternity test. They take blood samples from both the mother and the child to establish their separate DNA profiles. Every child's DNA is made up of the combined DNA of its parents. A reverse paternity test subtracts the mother's DNA profile from her child's. What's left is the father's DNA profile. Investigators then send Kincaid's DNA profile to Pam Newell for her analysis.
Now when I compare the profile from Adrian Kincaid in Lane C to the profile that I see from the fingernail scrapings in Lane A, I cannot distinguish them. They could have come, in fact, from the same source.
Investigators know they have identified a killer, but now they learn that Kincaid has fled the country. With the help of American police, he's tracked down, arrested in Miami, and brought back to Canada. Under intense questioning, Kincaid admits to being at the girl's house the day of the murders. But he denies killing the sisters and fingers Rohan Ranger as the murderer and mastermind behind the slayings.
Kincaid said that Ranger is a mind controller. That's what he told us. The man's very powerful. He can control your mind. You do what he tells you to do.
When police raid his apartment, they find over 40 books stolen from a local library.
Now, of all these books comes Ninjutsu, The Art of Invisibility, which is a book about ninjas, and essentially teaches you how to commit an assassination. And sure enough, ninjutsu talks about using a knife as the weapon of choice to commit these killings.
Police now think they know how Ranger enlisted Kincaid to join him in his vicious crime.
If you have to fix your pipes in the house, you don't call the minister. You call a plumber. And I think that Adrian Kincaid was the man for this job.
In his cousin, Ranger had found the accomplice he needed. Ranger needed Kincaid to gain access to the girl's house because he wasn't welcome there anymore. Bethany was the unwitting key to the plan. Police still don't know exactly what happened next, but they do know that by the time Ranger and Kincaid left the house, the two young women had been slaughtered. Rohan Ranger and Adrian Kincaid were convicted of the murders of Jolene and Bethany Samuels and sentenced to 25 years in prison with no chance of parole.
One thing is for sure, we have two girls that did nothing in their lives to deserve this. They lived fantastic, pure, prosperous lives with all the future in the world ahead of them and didn't deserve this.
When desire turned to obsession, murder became the ultimate form of control. The stories on Exhibit A are based on true cases. The forensic scientists and investigators are the actual individuals who worked on the cases. The names of the victims are fictitious. The names of the guilty are real.